Hello, everyone. I'm Debra Lindegren of Authentically Speaking, and I'm thrilled to be presenting to you today as part of Jody Colvard's VOW Summit, the power of your story to change the world. I wholeheartedly believe that we all have the power to change the world by the stories that we tell, because they give our listeners a window into our passions, our commitments, our values, and our beliefs, and a way for them to connect with us in our common humanity. So today we're going to talk about what makes a great story. Where do we get our stories and how do we put them together to have the greatest impact? I'd like to start by sharing a story with you about the day my pride was swallowed up by a lake in Minnesota. Just getting over to screen share. Here is a picture of what the cabin would have looked like at the time. Somewhat vintage, wouldn't you say? I was in my mid-30s. I had just gotten married to my first husband, and I thought I kind of knew it all, like most people in their mid-30s, I guess. I'd been to a lot of seminars. I'd studied personal development and the spiritual path, and it was all put to the test one sunny day in this cabin kitchen. I was meeting my in-laws for the first time, and I was determined to make a good impression. I wanted them to think their son had made a great choice in a wife. So after an afternoon of hiking and picking blueberries and sitting around the dinner table telling stories about growing up on Cape Cod or growing up in the Minnesota woods, it came time to do the dishes. Well, all the ladies jumped up, including my mother-in-law, who was in her late 70s, and my husband's great aunt, also in her late 70s. Well, I beat them to the kitchen sink, and I swept them away with my arm and said, "No, I've got this. I can take care of all of this." In my pride, I stood there wanting them to leave so I could show them how great and efficient I was at doing all these dishes. Well, my mother-in-law stood there somewhat stunned, being in her late 70s and a bit confused. She had early Alzheimer's, I think. And the great aunt came over to me and touched me on the elbow and whispered into my ear, "You know, Debra, it's good for people like the mother-in-law to feel valued and like they can still make a contribution. So if it's okay with you, we'll just have her stick here with us and dry some of these dishes." Well, in that moment, my pride fell hard. I was embarrassed. I was humiliated. So I gathered up what I could of myself, and we all did the dishes together, and it was a wonderful time. There's a moral to this story, that the world is not about me, and I learned that in my mid-30s. I learned to take stock of who is around me and how I can be of service to them and make them count and feel uplifted. Now, did this experience change the world? No, not really, but it changed me. And it changed the way I perceive the world. I learned humility that day, and I've made it my mission ever since then to think of others first, to observe who may need a hand, or if someone appears left out or alone. I make it my mission to include them or bring them into the conversation. Because what I learned that day was everyone wants to feel valued. Everyone wants to feel appreciated and like their life counts for something. And let us not forget, especially the elders, who can so easily feel discarded. We all have stories like these, stories that reveal our journeys, our missteps, our realizations, our 180-degree turns, our rising up, our falling down, and there's power in telling them, both for ourselves and for the world at large, because stories connect us at our core. They touch our hearts, and they compel us all to come up higher, to think about what we're doing and to take stock. I believe that as speakers and authors, bloggers and change makers, the ability to tell a story, to persuade an audience to take action, just may be the most important skill we can develop. Why stories? Storytelling is a powerful tool that's been used by every country and people on earth since the dawn of civilization. Indigenous tribes all around the world tell stories to pass on their culture to future generations. Parents tell stories to their children to help them navigate life's challenges or learn valuable lessons. And if there ever was a testament to the power of stories, it's got to be Mark Victor Hansen and Jack Canfield's amazing collection of Chicken Soup for the Soul books that opened the heart and rekindled the spirit and resulted in 500 million books sold and translations into 40 languages. What makes stories so powerful and compelling? Well, they're the narratives of our lives, descriptions of things we've endured or obstacles we've overcome, challenges over which we've triumphed. They're also tales of love lost, of missed opportunities, of our trials and tribulations. And when we tell them, everyone can relate. When we tell them with passion and conviction, they become change agents in and of themselves because they touch listeners emotionally. They make us feel something. Stories bypass our logical minds and grab us emotionally. And therefore they can move people into action. They can make people angry, determined, and emboldened. They can make us wiser, kinder, and more compassionate toward ourselves and others, just like my experience in that Minnesota cabin. When we tell stories about ourselves, especially a vulnerable one, we reveal the essence of who we are, what we think, what we feel, and what makes us human. And this makes us much more relatable to our listeners. I believe all of us have a gold mine of stories within us, things we've experienced that have shaped us, inspired us, and changed us to become better humans, to become better change agents, and to care more about the world in which we live. But good stories don't just happen. Let me get back to my slides here. Good stories are written down and refined and told in as few words as possible. Therefore, storytelling is an art form, like Mark Twain once said, or this quote is actually attributed to several different people. I would have written a shorter letter if I'd had more time. Well, there are strategies and guidelines that can make a good story great. Every story has a beginning, middle, and end, BME. The beginning, experts say we have about 6 seconds to hook our audience. And the best way to do that is to come up with some title, like a Twitter headline, to hook them quickly, to have them sit up and take notice. For example, the day my pride was swallowed at a Minnesota lake. The middle of the story is the story itself, the message we're trying to convey. And that has components that are important as well, which I'll get to in a minute. And the end, of course, is where we tell the moral of the story, where we anchor the lesson or make our call to action to our audience. We leverage the emotional journey they've been on to make our final point. The end is where we rally them to think or act differently. We might say it outright, or it might be implied by the lesson we learned, like in my Minnesota Lake story. Now, where to find our stories? Well, one tip I want to pass on is to keep a story journal. You'll always have stories at the ready. When you have a life experience or something dawns on you, or you think back to an occurrence in your life, write it down. Write down an outline of the event as it happened. Write down what you learned or gleaned from that experience and how it might have changed you. Write down what you witnessed. You can just do it in outline form and then consider the message or the lesson that it conveys. Sometimes a story can have several different lessons depending on how you tell it. How to develop your story. How to decide which story to tell. You open up your story journal and you think to yourself, well, which story should I use? Well, as with all presentations, and a story in itself is a mini presentation, you want to start with the end in mind. What takeaway do you want the audience to have? And how is it relevant to them? But to answer these two questions, you first have to know your audience. You want to plan your story around what they care about, what's important to them. Pick a story that speaks to them directly, that will enliven them and help them overcome their own challenges or become more involved citizens, either at work or in their communities. All we have to do is a little research to find out what challenges or problems they have that need resolving. Now, I've already said the ending is the most important part of the story because this is the message that will inspire them and cause them to think differently and move them to take action. So as you think about your story and its lesson or the ending, think about it relative to the audience you're speaking to. You want your message to stay with them long after your presentation is over. It's what we want them to remember and rally around, the moral of our story. So there are some elements of exceptional storytelling, and I want to share them with you now. Number one is to appeal to the emotions. And we do this by being passionate. Yes, we know that stories inform and illuminate and inspire, but this only happens when we touch a person's heart before reaching their head. Persuasion is most effective when people are transported to another place by using a story. And passion in storytelling is everything. We can't inspire and transport people unless we're inspired ourselves. We transfer our passion through the emotional, heartfelt connection that stories create. A remarkable thing happens to our brains when we're hearing stories. Researchers at Princeton are finding out that if we share a story, the same regions of our brain light up in terms of blood flow between us and our audience, meaning that our brains get in sync. Carmine Gallo, who's the author of the book Talk Like TED, spent 500 hours studying the top TED Talks, some of which had been viewed 20 million times. And what did he find? The best speakers spend 65% of their presentations telling stories that reinforce the theme of their talk. Statistics and other data made up 25%, and the remaining 10% was about their credibility. The next technique for exceptional storytelling is a pattern interrupt, an incredibly effective tool. A pattern interrupt is when we see or hear something that is new, seems out of place, or is said in a counterintuitive way. It's not the same jargon we hear every day that goes in one ear and out the other. According to the Berkeley neuroscientist Dr. Pradeep, our brains are trained to look for something brilliant and new, something that stands out, something that looks delicious. When the brain detects something unexpected or surprising, it immediately says, "Oh, here's something new, I'd better pay attention." The feel-good chemical dopamine is released, and that acts as a kind of save button for our brain. In other words, scientists are now discovering that dopamine aids retention and learning. And what better way to release dopamine in your listeners than through a feel-good story? Now, I had an interesting experience. I was reading about a blogger talking about pattern interrupts. I sometimes call them brain interrupts, where something happens, it just stops you in your tracks. Well, he said he was driving to work one day and noticed a large billboard, which ironically had been there every other day he'd driven, but this billboard today was new. It was big, bright yellow, and in bold black letters it said, "Your wife is hot." And he thought, what? What's that on a billboard? And as he read the next line, he understood. Why not get her a new air conditioner? "Your wife is hot" doesn't belong on a billboard out in the middle of nowhere or on the side of a highway unless you're trying to sell air conditioners. The whole point is it was a pattern interrupt. We didn't expect that to be there, and it got our attention enough to have us read the next line. That is the whole point of a pattern interrupt. When we see something unusual like that, something that's surprising, it immediately says, "Oh, here's something new, I better pay attention." And the feel-good chemical dopamine is released once again. So there, the image or the message is saved in our brain. Okay, back to my screen share here. Let me get the next slide for you. Seth Godin, the New York Times bestselling author, he's an ex-marketing guru and an executive, and he is now a blogger, a speaker, and an author. He's churned out hundreds of storytelling tips over the years and has even stated that marketing itself is one big story. It's an exercise in storytelling. But what must we know when considering our stories and our presentations? We all know that we live in a time of content overload. The competition for audience attention is fierce. If you're memorable, engaging, and spreading an interesting message, you can win their attention. But if you're remarkable, then you'll be remembered and valued by the audience. So how can we be memorable and remarkable? That brings us to the next point. We want to share our stories as change makers. We want to start movements. We want to have ideas that gain momentum and change things around the world. So we can have great ideas and a great emotional story, but if nobody can remember what we said, it doesn't matter much in the long run. So here's some ways to be more memorable and more remarkable. As I've already mentioned, have a quirky opening hook. Some experts say a Twitter-like headline that gets my attention. Your wife is hot on a billboard on the side of a highway. The power of 3 makes things easier to remember. You'll see that a lot in presentations, even in ads, even in fairy tales like the 3 Bears. Another thing you might want to consider is to create a storyboard of your story, highlighting the ups and downs. They call it a story arc. There's a beginning, middle, and an end. Maybe there was a challenge, then there was a highlight, then there was a low, and then there was another highlight. We see this often in movies, and every movie starts with a storyboard. Another way to be memorable and to be remarkable is to pull people along by introducing some kind of conflict or tension, just like in fairy tales and also in movies. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. Oh, what a bummer. Okay, well then how do we rise from that? Another way is to intensify your story with vivid language and intonation. So for example, sweat was dripping down my chest and the back of my neck and soaking my shirt in a matter of minutes, versus it was so hot. One of the best ways to be memorable is to take me into the story. I was working with a client recently and she was telling a story. I was listening to give her critique and feedback. She was telling a story about her journey to Machu Picchu, of climbing the mountain. And she was talking to me about climbing the mountain. So I stopped her and I said, Kirsty, this could be so much more powerful. Instead of telling me about your climb the mountain, put me into the climb with you. Take me there. Get on the ground. I want to see you. She was talking about going from one rock to the next on her hands and knees. I said, get on your hands and knees. Talk to me like you're actually in the climb. Bring me there with you. This is one of the best ways to bring our listeners into our story, is to be vivid with our descriptions. The slimy rocks at any moment. As I looked over to the side, I wondered, would I fall 200 feet to my death? Fear gripped me, and yet I put one foot in front of the other and move forward as you're telling the story. That's how we grab our audience's attention. So that's our last point about number 4, be authentic. Take the audience into the journey with you. When we can tell a story from that place, from being totally vulnerable and just acting it out as though no one's watching, the audience gets fully drawn in. They can so relate to what we're doing, what we're telling, what we're saying. They experience it as we experience it. And that's how we change the world, one audience at a time. Memorable stories, through all of these tips that I've just shared with you, are the ones that are shared. The memorable stories are the ones that are shared. And it spreads the message much further than just the immediate audience who first heard it. This is how movements gain traction and keep going. And this is how civilizations and cultures survive and evolve over centuries. When we tell our stories persuasively, emotionally, and memorably, we capture the hearts and the imagination of our audience. When we're authentic and share from our heart, we create a lasting connection. We inspire people. We persuade them. We want them to rise up and create change in this world. It's been my great joy to share these ideas on storytelling with you. We've only had so much time today, so I invite you to connect with me for more tips on storytelling and creating presentations that inspire. I'd really love to hear from you. I'd love to hear your stories. Feel free to send them my way in an email. I'm going to share with you my contact information so you have it in the screen share here. It'll be our last screen of the day. There it is, Debra at authenticallyspeaking.com. That's all I have for today. I hope the ideas I've shared have inspired you to mine the gold in your own stories. I believe with all my heart that we can all change the world with our stories, starting one audience at a time. All we need to do is go out there and tell them. So happy storytelling, everybody.